So you convict a war criminal for destroying priceless sacred mausoleums. Great, justice is served, right? Well, not quite, because then you face an even bigger question. How do you actually repair a crime against history itself? That's what we're digging into today, the landmark Timbuktu reparations case that tried to figure that out.
And that's really the heart of the matter, isn't it? I mean, you're not just talking about rebuilding some walls, you're talking about trying to heal a wound to history, to faith, to a community's entire identity. How in the world does a court put a price tag on that? How do you even begin to make something like that right?
All right, here's our roadmap for this explainer. We'll kick things off with the crime itself. Then we'll look at the first attempt to make amends, why it ran into trouble, and what the higher court decided in the end. And finally, we'll unpack what it all means for international justice.
Okay, let's set the scene. We're in Timbuktu. For centuries, this city's name has been synonymous with, ancient wisdom and incredible history. But back in 2012, it became the scene of something truly awful. A direct attack on that history. An act that would set in motion a legal battle that went all the way to the International Criminal Court.
So, here's how it all went down. In 2012, this guy, Ahmad al-Faqi al-Mahdi, intentionally directs attacks on 10 of these priceless buildings. Fast forward to 2016, and the International Criminal Court finds him guilty of war crimes for it. A year later, the court issues what's called a reparations order to try and compensate the victims. But, and this is key, it wasn't over. The victims, through their lawyer, actually appealed parts of that order in 2018. They said, wait a minute, this isn't quite right.
So that brings us to the court's first crack at this. What was in that original plan to make amends?
And just so we're all on the same page, what exactly is a reparations order? Think of it like a court-ordered plan to fix the harm done. And it's not always just about cash. It can mean individual payments for sure, but it can also be about collective projects, things that benefit the entire community, or even symbolic gestures.
Okay, so the court's initial plan had a few big components. First, they said, look, the whole community of Timbuktu was harmed, so most of the help should be collective, for everybody. They decided individual payments would only go to a really small, specific group of people. And here's a really important detail. They handed off the job of figuring out who was a victim to an administrative body, the Trust Fund for Victims, or TFV.
And this is where things get really interesting, because the lawyer for the victims took one look at this plan and said, hold on. He saw two major flaws, two big problems that he believed would shut the door on justice for a lot of people who were hurt the most.
So what was flaw number one? It all came down to a simple question. Who gets individual help? The court's plan drew a very, very tight circle around who could qualify.
And here are the two words that caused all the trouble. Exclusively dependent. The court said you could only get individual reparations for economic loss if your livelihood exclusively depended on those buildings. Think about that. You had to prove your entire income was tied to those sites. Now, you can kind of see why a court might do this, maybe to keep things manageable, but wow, what an incredibly high bar to set for people who've already lost so much.
Which, of course, raises the question, is that really fair? What about the ripple effect? This one act of destruction didn't just affect a handful of people. It sent shockwaves through the whole community.
Exactly. The victim's lawyer pointed out all the people this rule just completely ignored. Think about it. The local business owners who depended on tourism. That tourism vanished overnight. What about the families who had to literally flee for their lives, losing their homes, their property, or even just people whose jobs were only partly tied to the sites? Their harm was just as real, but according to this rule, they were out of luck for individual help.
Okay, so that was the first major issue. The second one was less about money and more about power. It wasn't just about who gets help, but about who gets the final say.
Here's the breakdown. The victim's argument was pretty straightforward. Deciding who is legally a victim is a judge's job, period. But the original plan handed that power over to an administrative body, the trust fund. So imagine you apply for help and this administrative group says no. Under the original plan, what could you do? There was no clear way to appeal to an actual judge. Your case just stopped. It basically took away the right to have a judge review your claim.
So, with these two huge arguments on the table, the case gets kicked up to the ICC's higher court, the appeals chamber. This is where the final decision is going to be made. So, let's see what they did.
All right, this is the scorecard, the final verdict. It's a bit of a mixed bag. First up, that exclusive dependence rule for individual aid. The appeals chamber actually confirmed it. They agreed with the lower court.
But, and this is a massive but, on the second point, who gets the final say? They amended the plan. Big win for the victims here. They ruled that if the trust fund says no, you absolutely have the right to ask a judge to review it. And they added another critical change. Originally, victims had to reveal their identities to the defense team. The appeals chamber said nope, safety comes first. They amended the rules so victims could stay anonymous.
So let's zoom out. What does all this legal back and forth really mean? Well, this case wasn't just about Timbuktu. It ended up setting some really important ground rules for how we think about justice for victims in the future.
Basically, this judgment hammered home 3 huge ideas. Number 1, judges have to have the final say. You can have administrative bodies helping out, but the buck stops with a judge. That's essential. Number 2, victim security is paramount. Protecting victims can be even more important than the convicted person's right to know who they are. And number 3, courts have to do this tricky balancing act between helping specific individuals who were deeply harmed and helping the entire community that was wounded.
And so all of this leaves us with one last really big question to think about. We've just walked through this incredible legal effort to repair a terrible wrong. But when the crime isn't just against property, but against culture, against history, against the very soul of a place, can any court order, no matter how fair or well-designed, ever really make things right? Can justice on paper ever truly repair that kind of damage?